believer in punctuality. So it's 10 o'clock. We might as well get started. Some more people may trickle in. But first of all, I want to thank you all for coming here today. And it's kind of a special day, actually, to be doing this talk. And this is a talk that I did a lot last year. When Art and Arcana came out, I think it was October 23rd. This is a talk we had given at Gen Con, at San Diego Comic-Con, at New York Comic-Con, at Pixar, at Lucasfilm, at Google, at the Strand bookstore in New York, at Powell's in Portland, Oregon, like all of the coolest places I thought anyway to give a talk about this book that we did that's called Dungeons & Dragons, Art and Arcana, A Visual History. This is a special day, though, because this is Gary Gygax's day. This is Gary Gygax's birthday today. And so honor the founders and legends. My friend Luke Gygax, he's actually doing a whole stream from LA today, which I'm very sorry to miss, but I'm happy to be here in Helsinki. This is my second time in Helsinki ever. And both times it's been in the summer, so I've gotten to see the late nights, the sun getting up at 3, because I'm so jet lagged, of course, I am up at 3 to see the sunrise at 3. But yeah, it's really my pleasure to come and talk to you about this project that myself, my good friend Mike Witwer, who some of you may know is the author of a book called Empire of Imagination, which is a biography of Gary Gygax. His brother Sam Witwer, who's probably most famous as being like Darth Maul. It's pretty cool to be Darth Maul. Like, no matter what I ever do working on the history of games, I will not be as cool as Sam because Sam is like Darth Maul. And he does a bunch of other stuff. He's on Supergirl. Do you guys get that show, Supergirl, here? Yeah, he's the big villain this last season. And our good friend Kyle Newman, who is a film director, he did a movie called Fanboys about Star Wars fandom, which is pretty cool. And he's worked on a whole bunch of geeky kinds of Lucasfilm-y, Star Wars-y things. So this book really, it was Kyle's idea to start with. Kyle is the guy who got it into his head that there should be a book kind of looking back as we get closer to 50 years of Dungeons & Dragons on the whole history of the brand with a focus in particular on its visuals, on the art. And why now? Well, D&D is kind of big just right now. And like when I started working on the history of D&D in like 2007, it was not at all clear that Dungeons & Dragons was going to have this amazing resurgence that it's had since the publication of 5th edition. And wow, we just kind of like lucked into this. And even when Art and Arcana came out, I mean, these are, years of double-digit growth in sales. The latest estimates from Wizards are now that 40 million people play D&D at the moment, at least once a year. 40 million, which are numbers that even back in the day are pretty shocking. And what do we owe it to? We owe it to the popularity of things like Stranger Things, to Critical Role, and of course to the amazing work that Wizards did on 5th edition. But like all these things, we really owe it to the people, right, who have just always loved this game and that have found this incredible experience from playing role-playing games. So yeah, I'm sure that if you're here at Ropecon, I don't need to tell you anything on the slide about kind of what D&D is. This book is really a lot about what D&D was, and D&D wasn't necessarily for the cool kids when I was a kid. Anyway, role-playing was not for the cool kids. This is an ad, actually, that they put out around 1981 or so that appeared in Boy Scouts magazines, things like that, that kind of, I think, projects so well the story of the era of D&D then. And this is one of the great advantages of doing a visual history of D&D. There's something about just even the colors, the fonts, what people are wearing, things like that. That just transports you back to the initial D&D fad so well that we love doing so much as we put this book together. So where did D&D come from? I'm going to talk a little bit about the history of D&D. This is what I primarily work on and write about. There has been this tradition that's gone around for years, and it's a European tradition as well as an American one around collecting miniature figures, painting them, and fighting little war game battles with them. Some of you may recognize that gentleman in the upper left up there, a guy by the name of Peter Cushing, who, if you're a Star Wars fan or maybe a fan of the old Hammer horror films, you may know him from many of his projects. But he was also a miniature collector and a wargamer. This was a hobby that a lot of people throughout the 20th century gravitated to from kind of all walks of life. Now, the picture directly below him shows a scene from 1968 from a place called the Horticultural Hall, which is a little, I don't know, it's the kind of place you'd have weddings and flower shows. And there's this small town called Lake Geneva, Wisconsin. And the second fellow to the right in that picture is Gary Gygax, who we are celebrating his birthday today. And it was at this first Lake Geneva War Games convention that he held that year in the Horticultural Hall that he got to play this game called the Siege of Bodenberg. The Siege of Bodenberg, you can kind of see some of the minis there. It was this game that you played with these little elastilin figures, which were made by the Hauser Corporation, imported from West Germany at the time, that had these elaborate scenes of castles and things like that. Before that day, Gary wasn't so much interested in medieval miniature warfare. He had been a war gamer and was kind of interested in wargaming. But that's when he really connected with the medieval period. And this ultimately led him to put out a bunch of war game rules for the medieval period called Chainmail. And it was our pleasure in Art and Arcana to be able to show Gary's personal copy of that. We just kind of went and found everybody who had anything that was like cool related to D&D and tried to get pictures of it and put it into the book so we could show you Gary's original copy of Chainmail. Now, famously, Chainmail had tacked on to the final third of the booklet some fantasy rules. Some rules for how you would play not just a medieval war game, but how you could incorporate a magic user who could cast Fireball and Lightning Bolt, several other spells, Light and Darkness, Phantasmal Terrain, these kinds of things. And rules for orcs and dragons and balrogs and goblins and all these like Tolkien monsters and these trolls that were borrowed from Paul Anderson, and everything was sorted into these categories of law, neutrality, and chaos that the different forces kind of converged around. It's a pretty cool idea. And it really caught on with this guy you see on the left here, whose name is Dave Arneson. See, Dave had been playing with Gary in this campaign that was centered around a little wargaming club they had called the Castle and Crusade Society. Now, Gary lived in Lake Geneva. Dave lived up in what we in America call the Twin Cities, which is Minneapolis and St. Paul in Minnesota. Not too far away, though. It's a drive you could make in, 7 hours or so, probably. And Gary had devised this imaginary world for this club that he called the Great Kingdom, and the map of it is what you can see behind their portraits here. And Dave had a little section that was assigned to him. Originally, he called it the Northern Marches, but eventually took on the name of the biggest city in it, the city called Blackmore. And when the Chainmail rules came out, Dave started running these games in Blackmore and doing things with all those goblins and orcs, but they were a little bit different from a traditional miniature war game like the Siege of Bodenberg, right, where you would be, playing this all out on the tabletop and trying to take your castle with all of your ballistas or whatever. Instead, he was really interested in these like underground battles, where you'd have a small squad of these like heroes and wizards who would go and fight these very, very tiny skirmish games that would just take place in a single room against a set of monsters. And if you defeated them, you would not only get their loot, but you would also gain experience points. And the experience points were actually based on the point values assigned to those monsters in Chainmail. And because there's all these point systems you use to make sure that war games like this were properly balanced. This is a pretty cool idea. And Gary was kind of reading about it in some of Dave's Wargame Zine contributions. And so Gary said, hey, why don't you come down and like show me what all you're working on? And that collaboration led to what you see on the left here, which is the first page of the first draft of D&D, the cover sheets of the original pieces of paper that Gary, after he saw Blackmore, he said, oh my God, we've got to write this up. We're going to make this whole game and sell it based on this. And so he sent those off to Dave, and Gary has his notes on it, Dave has his notes, and they collaborated, and they ended up putting this little game together. Now, one of the funny things about this game, and when you're doing a visual history focusing on the art, they didn't have a lot of budget, really, to put this game together. In fact, their entire art budget for publishing D&D was $100. And so they asked some friends of theirs if they would make like some art for it. And actually, Gary's wife's half-sister was one of the people. Her name is Keenan Powell, who did maybe a third of the art that's in there. This guy named Greg Bell, who was probably the main artist, did about half of it. But then there were a few random pieces from people like Cookie Corey. Cookie Corey was the wife of a guy who was one of Gary's gaming friends. And we were able to show in Art and Arcana, this bottom image there, the beautiful witch, this actually appears in the first printing of D&D. But this one of the ugly witch above was a discarded image. As you can see, Cookie Core is written on it. I'd love to try this over, make it better and perfect, help. Not quite ready for prime time, even in a $100 art budget sort of range. So we really love being able to find things like this that were kind of discarded variants or just interesting kind of asides in the history of the art of D&D. But yeah, when it came out, it looked like this. There was a wood grain box. They made 1,000 copies of it. Inside, there were 3 little booklets, the 3 little brown books, we call them today. That cover art is a piece by Greg Bell. But see, Greg Bell, he was a teenager at the time. This is kind of an important thing to get about how they did this art. He was probably 17 when he made these pieces. And he was a big comics fan, but not so much so versed in kind of the fantasy literature. So he ended up having to get some inspiration from comics. And you can see here there's a particular copy of Strange Tales, I think it's 167, that all of these are taken from. And there's the first is from a Doctor Strange panel, actually. I forget exactly who Doctor Strange is fighting there, that rearing rider is swiped from. But that's actually Nick Fury, who has become this barbarian that you see below. Obviously, Nick Fury looks a little different in the Marvel Cinematic Universe today. And from Eerie Tales, you can see this initial picture that went into making the Sphere of Doom, which we, of course, all know today as the Beholder. And we loved being able to show all the kind of variations that these monsters have gone through the years, and the various editions, and how the art grew more sophisticated. You can see from Greg Bell's original there, right next to his Tom Wam's version from the first Monster Manual. And then we just try to go through every edition by edition, to show how the Beholder evolved. My friend Mike Whitwer, he's a bit of a punster, and he called these evolutions. It's like evolutions, except of evil. I gave him a pun budget as we put this together. There was like a certain number of puns I thought we could tolerate for this, and I was willing to give him evolutions for that. We also love being able to show different versions of the modules that became so iconic. If you made a book like this and it was just about the art, I think you would really be missing something about D&D. Like maps and dice and things like that are so important to the visual experience of D&D. And it was our privilege to be able to reproduce a copy of the original Tomb of Horrors, which was a tournament that Gary Gygax ran in 1975, the first Origins convention, which was then in Baltimore, which is a convention that goes on to this day. I think it's in Ohio now is where they hold Origins most of the time these days. But he ended up getting another teenager, a kid named Tracy Lesh, who was then 16. He was in one of Gary's daughter's high school classes, and contracted with him to provide a series of illustrations that could accompany the Tomb of Horrors. So the Tomb of Horrors, for those of you that don't know it, it's this like horrible death trap where like you can be instantly disintegrated, fall into pits filled with spikes, and you're just dead. And they sent this group of 15 people down into it because the purpose of a tournament was, to have a winner. And to have a winner, you need to kill everybody else in the entire world, pretty much. But because they had to run it so fast, they had to run it in just 2 hours, Gary wanted to be able to have pictures he could show. And so rather than having to describe what you're seeing, the great green face, he wanted to get Tracy to draw a picture of that, so just hold it up and say, this is what you see. And these were some of the first real visualizations other than monsters that were created for D&D. Initially, when you look through the little brown books, most of what you see in them is just monster portraits, because who knows what like a hippogriff looks like necessarily, right? Or let alone a beholder. So that was necessary to visualize them. The Tomb of Horrors is really when we started getting into showing scenes with context and like what's really going on, which is just great stuff. And of course, the version below it there, Dave Sutherland's from the published Tomb of Horrors module from 1978. And, if you want to do visuals, you can't do better than the Dragon. The first issue of the Dragon, from that point forward, the guy actually who did the illustration for it, Tim Kask, who was the original editor of the Dragon, he had taken a calligraphy class when he was in college, and this was his professor who did the Dragon that you see on the first issue of the Dragon. But the dragon was a place where people could experiment with what D&D could look like and feel like. And when you see images like Dan Horn's, this is from an April edition for April Fools of the dragon, this kind of Norman Rockwell-like portrait of this guy with his beholder girlfriend that he's trying to impress. It's a place where they could be more playful with kind of what D&D was, and it's a great illustration of the way that this brand really got into people's heart. And the dragon was a huge part of that. It was also our privilege to be able to raid the archives of the good people at Wizards of the Coast. Wizards was enormously generous to us in putting this project together. They gave us a lot of their time, access to their archives. I love the story of this particular piece, which is the original art for the Holmes Basic box set you see below. A friend of mine who actually has worked at Wizards for, must be 20 years now, named Kurt Gould. Kurt actually found the original art of this when they were moving an old warehouse, and somebody found it behind something. And he was kind of on the other side of an aisle, and he heard some people saying, "Oh, hey, we just moved this box. There's some kind of painting here. It's a dragon that's sitting on a pile of coins, and there's two people who are coming at it. There's an archer." And Kurt Gould ran around to the other side and saw the original art for this was just lying there in this warehouse where it had been for who knows how long. And that, unfortunately, is the story of a lot of this art. It was scattered to the nine winds. A lot of it was lost, but we were really privileged to be able to find so much of it. And I photographed that myself at Wizards to include it in here. And in person, it is just such a beautiful, vibrant, idiosyncratic piece. The early art of D&D, what's so great about it, I wouldn't say Dave Sutherland was the finest technical artist, but his art, his heart really comes through in his art, right? And the love of the game comes through. We even found things like, this is from the manuscript of the Holmes Basic set that you see there, that interesting image of, that you see right below there of the Displacer Beast. It's, I think, the first depiction of the Displacer Beast. And it was done by Eric Holmes's son, Chris Holmes. And like it was never appeared anywhere but in that manuscript. So we love being able to find the things like this. When we call this book Art and Arcana, we're for real. Okay, this is a book that's like about the art, but about finding the real arcane like parts of it that you won't see anywhere else. And again, when you get the original art and you can photograph it and reproduce it in a a nice coffee table style book like ANA, you just get to see classic iconic pieces like this Trampier that are done, I think, so much. It looks so much more vivid when you get them from the original art. And I love like the little just direction things too, of what percent they're going to reduce it to, and that it's the stone giant, and things like that. And yes, that's from the Monster Manual. And boy, wasn't it neat for the first time when I saw the cover painting of the 1977 Monster Manual. Actually, there's a guy named Dave Mandel who is a Hollywood guy. He's the showrunner of a show called Veep. Do you see Veep here? I don't know if you do. It's an HBO show in America. But he's done a ton of work, and he's a big D&D fan. And he was generous enough to let us get a very, very high-resolution scan of this. And it looks so different. The printing process they had in 1977 really wasn't that great. And so, even if you get like a Monster Manual that's in tip-top shape, that's just as mint as it could be, it is so much more vivid to be able to like see it, reproduced from the original painting this way. We could afford a little bit more in terms of art photography than they could. And I'd say the same of this guy, of the original Player's Handbook image. This is one that, it's interesting, the bottom of it is actually cut off. So where you see the gray legs on the figure in the foreground, you can't see those at all on the actual Player's Handbook image. I'm not sure if Sutherland or Tramp didn't have time to finish that. I mean, it could be that he just was planning to color them something else and just put in gray as a temp, or it could be it's supposed to be male. I can't really tell. And yeah, this beautiful Sutherland, the Dungeon Master's Guide cover. When they printed these things, they had this oval that went over the floating city, right, on the left-hand side, and so you couldn't really see the entire work of art. Again, just being able to get these in their original form and see them as they were intended was a real treat. But just getting back more to the history of D&D, all these books that have like demon idols and like demons holding, it's actually an ifrit, but most people, they might think that's a demon, holding some poor woman that they're fighting. This started to get people a little worried about D&D and about what people were up to. And this kind of came to a head in 1979 when a kid by the name of James Dallas Egbert III went missing. And it was believed that he had been playing D&D and had gotten lost in the steam tunnels beneath his university in Michigan. And it turned out that that wasn't actually true. It turned out that James had run away for reasons completely unrelated to D&D. But what happened is the New York Times and many nightly news channels in America suddenly started promoting D&D by talking about it day and night. There was this dangerous cultish game that was taking over kids' minds, is making them crazy, which of course made every kid in America buy D&D. I mean, why wouldn't you buy D&D if that was the situation? And so this satanic panic, as we call it now, was the best thing in terms of sales that ever happened to D&D. Sales basically quadrupled. This went from being a pretty marginal hobby that not a lot of people were into, college kids, some high school kids, mostly people who came from either wargaming or from science fiction fandom did it. But then it became this huge mainstream phenomenon. And, this made parents nervous, right? So the kids now are bringing these books home, and if you flip through them, you see images like this. Probably my single favorite work of art in all of D&D is Errol Otis's Shub-Niggurath, which you see there in the upper left. If you're like a conservative Christian Midwestern parent and you see this in books that your 11-year-old child is reading, you might have some cause for concern. And you do see, as the game became more popular, its visuals started to shift a bit. And we love doing kind of jump cuts like this in Art and Arcana. We have these back-to-back on the same spread. This is 1 year there of the Gateway to Adventure. This is around 1980. You can see there's a demon on the door. There's a demonic tail that's emerging from it. And then 1 year later, the TSR catalog has Morley the Friendly Wizard. No more demons. Now it's much more cartoonish and kid-friendly, and that is the beginning, again, of this new visual aesthetic that started to manifest then. But it was kind of hard to shake, right? This was the era when Bad Bothered About Dungeons and Dragons, which was an advocacy group, was formed. They were very concerned about all this teen devil worship, and of course, the famous chick track, Dark Dungeons, which has Elfstar and your indoctrination into Wiccan witchcraft cults that is inevitable if you play D&D, was going to get you. And this was perhaps most famously immortalized in Mazes and Monsters, which was a little movie that was made as an after-school special that showed a kid going through what James Dallas Egbert did not go through, but in fact going crazy and believing he was his character. And the kid is played by Tom Hanks. It's a true story. A young Tom Hanks was the star of this Mazes and Monsters show, which you should all watch if you haven't seen it. It is, yes?
It's one of the starting points for Finnish life. It was shown in Finnish TV, and some people watched it, and that's so cool, I want to do that.
Exactly. Who would not want to dress up and go out into the world and have these adventures? And this is a scene from a movie called E.T. It came out in 1982, and your game has arrived when Steven Spielberg's blockbuster of the summer features kids playing D&D. I mean, the rumor is actually that Spielberg auditioned a lot of these kids by playing D&D with them to kind of see how well they could act and react to situations and things like it. And this ushered in an era then. The game had become so popular. It was appearing throughout popular culture. It was selling, certainly TSR was making $20 million, $25 million a year at this point. That let them afford real artists. And this is the era when people like Jeff Easley got involved with D&D. And Jeff Easley, he was the workhorse who did almost all of the D&D covers from 1983 up until even the late 90s. And as you can see, the new Dungeon Master's Guide, not so much with the demon on it. It's still a little spooky, right? But it's not so much with looking openly satanic. As long as it's not openly satanic, we can probably get away with that. They brought in Jeff Easley and another fellow by the name of Larry Elmore. A lot of people started with the 1983 basic rules that you see here, the red box of D&D as we call it, that Frank Menser edited. And Frank actually held on to this piece of the concept art for the original red box set, and we were fortunate enough to get him to let us photograph that and bring that to everyone. But of course, by this point too, you were getting the cartoon starting, right? So the cartoon started in 1983 in September, ran for those 2 years, and brought a whole new kind of visual dimension of D&D to a younger audience. Around the same time, of course, CBS, who aired this show, was also starting to air 60 Minutes investigative reports on how dangerous D&D was, and there was this kind of schizophrenic, depending on what time of day you're watching, D&D is either a fun pastime for kids, or it's killing your kids, and you need to burn all those books right now. And they kind of went back and forth around all this. And, the brand really started to, I think, diversify then to storytelling. We start to get into things like this idea of Dragonlance, where Tracy Hickman, who was a designer who worked for TSR, he had this proposal that they should do a series of modules that would be combined with novels, combined with calendars, combined with comic books. There would be this whole kind of transmedia platform for D&D that would be called Dragonlance. And this was a great idea, it turns out. And this really kind of defined the D&D brand for most of the next decade once people started to look at what storytelling platforms can we spread this to. And this is a piece of Larry Elmore's concept art for one of the many Dragonlance covers, an original acetate, as we call it, that is in the hands of a friend of mine, a collector named Bill Meinhard. But yeah, this was an era that's kind of, for many, the peak D&D fantasy art era, these beautiful easily covers of Oriental Adventures and Legends and Lore. They had to rebrand deities and demigods as Legends and Lore around this time, since the idea that they're actually like deities was another thing parents were a little uncomfortable with. And, but it led to some fantastic artwork, that's for sure. We had to just get into anytime we could find an original concept version of a map next to something that's very famous, we needed to show it if we could. This is a good example of what you'll find in Art and Arcana, the village of Hamlet that you see here on the right that leads up to the Temple of Elemental Evil. What you see on the right there is from the home campaign that TSR ran in 1976 that Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson all had their little characters in. Everyone around the office played. And then the version of the map that actually appears in the published T1 module. And once Dragonlance took off, right, the next thing you know, people were like, well, we should really do more of these kinds of stories. This was an era now where Gary Gygax had left the company. Lorraine Williams was now in charge of TSR. And she charged her design staff to go out and find more of these campaign settings. And there was this crazy guy who had been writing into the Dragon these articles about these like forgotten realms that he had come up with. And apparently he had like 10,000 pages of notes from this campaign that he'd been running up in Canada, and the people at TSR just didn't know what to do with it. But when Lorraine charged them, find me more campaign settings, Jeff Grubb and a few other people said, hey, let's have him send us his maps and, look through some of this stuff. Maybe there's something to all of the forgotten realms. And so we were able to reproduce things like what you see there on the right, which is a little bit of the Sword Coast. You may see familiar places like Baldur's Gate and Neverwinter Nights and Waterdeep listed there. Those are Greenwood's original maps that you had to kind of, they had to tape them together because they were across so many sheets. And when he sent them in, they had to reassemble it like a jigsaw panel, Jeff Grubb did, to figure it out. And in Forgotten Realms, you found things like this character, this Xanathar guy. I understand he's a bad guy. Is what I've heard, that he's somebody to watch out for if you're hanging around the Undermountain or below Waterdeep. And the Forgotten Realms took the transmedia experience to a very different place than it had been before, because now you could sell a PC game based on what you were doing in the setting. And Pools of Radiance, which came out from SSI in the Gold Box Edition, came out simultaneously with a module, with the Ruins of Adventure, and had the same cover art. The idea you could now release the video game and the module, and there was a novel, and all these things kind of came together, showed the direction that people were starting to steer D&D at this point. And one of the small pleasures for me in looking at something like Pool of Radiance is how you can take the original portrait of the kobold from the Monster Manual and compare it to the art that they actually ended up using, and just see how faithfully they copied all of these things. And this, of course, now that Gary was out of the company, did lead to a reinvention of D&D, to D&D having a second edition. And this is my personal favorite of all of Jeff Easley's art, is his cover for the second edition Dungeon Master's Guide. And again, just being able to get all these as the original art that we can show in this level of detail was a real pleasure for us. In the era of all these new campaigns now that followed second edition, beyond just the Forgotten Realms and Dragonlance, things like Dark Sun, where you get in people like Brahm. I got to go to Brahm's house, actually, outside Seattle and interview him in his studio, which, as you can imagine, like is all like black wood shelves with skulls and like metal stuff, and it was just like, visiting Brahm was pretty awesome. Wherever we could, we tried to show the sources that we knew people were inspired by. We certainly didn't talk to a single artist who did not say that they were inspired by Frazetta. Like Frazetta was like the #1 person. Even Errol Otis was like, I was inspired by Frazetta, which if you know Errol Otis's art, I would think he was inspired by the Fabulous Furry Freak Brothers and like underground comics a bit more than Frazetta. But definitely this became a huge dimension of the visual history now that they could get the caliber of artists like Brahm that could deliver this kind of like raw, visceral material. Now I'm gonna, since this is a slightly abbreviated version of my talk, I'm gonna skip a little bit through some of this middle stuff here. Obviously, they went through a few versions of the second edition. Jeff Easley's still doing most of the covers. But you know, right around this time, around the early 1990s, when second editions was going through its own internal kind of point revision, there was this problem. There's this game that came out, this upstart game called Magic the Gathering. And in 1993, it started to kind of suck the oxygen out of the entire industry. And there was really no way to compete with it with your role-playing game products. TSR certainly tried. They did their Spellfire game, which drew on all of these campaign settings and had all these decks that you could build. But Magic was kind of a juggernaut. And you know, TSR at the time, they were getting a bit spread thin, I'll say. Having so many different campaign settings. If you liked Vampire the Masquerade, why aren't you instead playing Ravenloft, the campaign? If you like science fiction, you're playing Spelljammer. If you like, you know, Mad Max style adventure, why aren't you in Dark Sun? And then, of course, there's Greyhawk, there's Dragonlance. The brand had become a bit diffuse at this point. And unfortunately, this was not a good time for TSR. They pretty much went bankrupt around 1996. They stopped being able to publish The Dragon. They stopped being able to publish really anything. Until Wizards of the Coast, the people who made that Magic the Gathering game that was so successful, Peter Adkison, who founded that company, he grew up playing D&D, he loved D&D, and he reached out. It's a bit of a complicated story how it all worked out, but he managed to acquire D&D. And with it, drive to a third edition, which had its own very unique visual style. I really love the cover of Forge of Fury. But their books, interestingly enough, the books they put out, rather than the kind of Jeff Easley style art you had seen previously, the third edition books all look very in-universe. And you know, when you talk to Peter about the art style that he wanted a grittier, less high fantasy, kind of less, I don't know, less antiseptic, right, version of this. He wanted something that's a bit grittier. And he wanted to open the brand up to all sorts of kind of new ideas. The idea you could have a half-orc paladin was something that like he was really attached, because previous versions of D&D, they were kind of strict about who you could be. And you start seeing a lot more text about inclusivity, a lot more text about, you know, finding your own path to the story that you want to tell when you get to D&D 3rd edition. And actually, this image of this half-orc paladin, Peter kept this one. This is still sitting in his office at Gen Con in Seattle. He's no longer involved with Wizards, but he still owns that Gen Con convention that I will be at on Thursday. I'm going pretty much from here back to Gen Con. And there's a ton of great art that went through 3rd edition into 3.5. This visualization of the very famous Caves of Chaos, you know, is an example of how the brand really kept referring back to some of these original stories. They wanted to show you new and fresh visualizations of what the classics were. And you started to get some pretty amazing stuff in this era. I don't know if there's any Ebron fans here. Hands up for Ebron fans. Hands up for the Warforged. Oh, yeah. And, Wayne Reynolds and the many artists who worked on D&D in this era brought a very, very different style to the game that was very welcome. But, you still had some difficulties around this time. And you see this in advertisements. Like I said, period advertisements bring you into the situation of the game in a way that really nothing else could. World of Warcraft took over my life in November of 2004. I don't know if anyone else will fess up to the same. But, why sit around pretending you're an elf on a computer? We can do it with friends. Yeah, sorry, I was the guy pretending that I was an elf on a computer. Actually, I was Forsaken. I was always Horde. I don't know, people playing Alliance, I'm never going to understand you people. But this, of course, led to the development of the 4th edition of Dungeons & Dragons, which was really very focused on the MMO experience. It was very structured like it would be very readily adaptable to an MMO. It had the same kind of powers and cooldowns. It had the same tanking mechanics and support mechanics for classes. It felt almost like WoW, and nothing communicates the irony of that strategy so much, I think, as this ad on the lower right, which shows your books that you learned. That's the player's handbook and the Dungeon Master's Guide and the Monster Manual. And the best use of them is to prop up your laptop, where you'll be playing this computer version of the game, right? They had high hopes for this virtual tabletop experience they were building. I think they were a little ahead of its time. We're doing a bit better on virtual tabletops now than we were then. Right idea, maybe not the right time for it. And 4th edition art, looks like you're in an MMO, right? When you look at 4th edition art, it is this frantic, completely over the top. You've got huge pauldrons and oversized swords, and it looks like you'd be in like Final Fantasy or something like that. It's extremely dramatic. But I think it's commonly acknowledged that 4th edition didn't really capture the public imagination at the time. And there's a lot I love about 4th edition, actually, because I love crunchy tactical war games, and I think it plays very well tactically. I love the battle grids of 4th edition. I think there's a lot of great ideas in the system. But around this time, the best thing they could really do was look backwards in some respects. And their starter set that they put out for 4th edition, this is a cry back to their original fan base. Look, we're doing the same thing as the original Red Box. Really, we're still D&D, we promise. Don't forget that's us. That's the people who did that. And, there was a time when retro gaming looked like it was really going to be the future of D&D. This is the time a lot of people were doing clones of either 1st edition D&D or even original D&D. And this is kind of when I got serious about studying D&D, was around this time. And there was a lot of dispute over what the game was originally supposed to be like and who contributed more to the original game. And that's kind of how I entered this as a scholar. And we never would have imagined what would happen when 5th edition came out. Right. I knew Mike Merles before 5th Ed came out, and Chris and Jeremy, all of them. And they did a really great job of kind of taking, I think, the best things about 4th edition, but through the D&D Next process, which was the largest D&D playtest in history. They had like 150,000 people in that playtest. We actually did this playtest in, what was that, San Diego Comic-Con in 2013, I think. Yeah, we were among the legions who did that then, and they ended up with a great product. It's a pretty cool system, actually. And but it's still a system that is reverential to where the game started. It's still a system where Tiamat is a major antagonist, and I love just being able to juxtapose the Tiamat of now from the Tyranny of Dragons against that original Tiamat done by Sutherland in the Monster Manual, to just kind of show how the brand has evolved over the years. And everybody loves those kinds of callbacks, even these kids. Who are pretty cool kids, and that they recontextualize them. These were actually up on billboards around Los Angeles at this time. The Critical Role had become so huge that you would be driving down Sunset Boulevard in the same kinds of places that you would see, the ad for the latest movie, you would see Critical Role. It's a pretty cool era to live in, and they've done a tremendous amount, Critical Role has, in just getting getting people to get D&D, right? You can just watch D&D on Critical Role, and these teenagers who see it and they just reproduce that experience with their friends around a table. It has been an incredible ride. So this is kind of an abbreviated version of the talk. This is my last slide. We did this book. It's in 2 editions. Actually, it's probably in like 4 editions. If there's a special edition, there's a Barnes & Noble edition, there is a regular edition. I know there's a French edition. I think there's a Spanish edition coming that isn't out yet. But I'm happy to answer any questions any of you have about art and Arcana. That was like the lightning talk version of this. I usually have much more time to do this, so I hope that that was all legible, comprehensible. It's a lot of fun to do. Yes?
Was there like another round of that? Let's not put too much demons in here, or how did that like work after the biggest scandal times?
I mean, I think it became, it was certainly a big deal through 2nd edition, right? In 2nd edition, they didn't have demons and devils, right? They created like whole different names for them. But they were really kind of superficially rebranded. And the same way that when the Tolkien estate was mad about Balrogs, they just changed the name to Baelor. And like said, no, it's not a Balrog anymore. Halfling? Yeah, sure, it's a hobbit. No, it's a halfling. Yeah, I think today you can have demons and devils and it's okay. But probably throughout the 90s, I'd say, people were still pretty uncomfortable with what Jim Ward, who was a staff editor, called the angry mother phenomenon. You've got to avoid angry mothers. We have a few more minutes if there are more questions. Yes?
What do you think is the next step of Dungeons and Dragons? Where will it evolve next?
Well, it's a good question. I think the Critical Role, I think, has really, especially that spectacular Kickstarter, has, I think, in its own way, kind of sucked some oxygen out of the room of the direction of this. Necessarily, streaming is now the focus. Getting important personalities who are telling their stories that are already connecting with an audience is going to be a big focus. And you can see the Critical Role people put out their Tal'Darai source book, right, that you can play with, and I'm sure there's going to be a ton more things like that are gonna come. I think you'll see more campaigns. You'll see some classic campaigns continue to appear. They've been pretty good about revisiting things like the Tomb of Horrors, right, when they did the Tomb of Annihilation. You'll see those kinds of updates continue to appear, but I think certainly 5th edition has a tremendous amount of longevity, and I wouldn't expect we'll see a 6th edition like anytime soon. But you certainly will see much more focus on the online play and on Twitch and on streams and all of that for the foreseeable future.
So your personal favorite piece of art of the book?
Like I said, that Erolotus Chavnigrath is like, it's my single favorite piece of D&D art. And it's funny because like when I first met Erolotus and I told him that, he was so surprised because he said that is, the single work of art he did at the time that he felt showed his capabilities best. It was really the limits of what then he could have done. And actually, he still owns it. That's one that he has still held on to over all these years that he refuses to part with.
How do you see the representation of genders evolving in art?
Sure. I think it has been a positive evolution over the decades. Obviously, there were some issues in the beginning. And, we tried. I was very surprised, actually, to learn that in the original version of D&D, half of the artists who contributed to it were women. The Cookie Corey and Keenan Powell. When I heard the name Keenan Powell, it didn't even occur to me that was a woman. But yeah, there were some significant difficulties with representation. And I'd like to think that really by 3rd edition, I think when Sam Wood and Todd Lockwood were doing the work, I think you see women in more realistic armor already and kind of much more kind of parody in the roles and the depictions of the 3rd edition. Iconic characters like Ember, having the canonical representation of a monk be a woman of color, I think was pretty good for its time. And I think today they're doing quite well, I think, with the inclusivity in the brand. But yeah, it's been a struggle. I think we have time for one more quick question. Okay.
When you were doing research for the book, did you test out those like very early versions of chainmail and D&D?
I did. I mean, so I'd already kind of done that before this book. I have played original Chainmail, and I now run original D&D sometimes. But really, when I run it, it's a science project, right? You run it academically because there's so many things that players who are used to D&D just trip over immediately. Like there's no like ability checks. I mean, you can hack ability checks into it, but like ability scores basically do nothing. And there's no dex check, there's no perception check, there's nothing like that we're used to from playing anything from second edition forward. And so, yeah, those hit hard. But I still think it's fun, just from, again, a research perspective, to really try to recreate in a crunchy way how these original games worked. Well, I know we're out of time, but thanks so much for coming. It was a pleasure to talk to you guys about this today. And remember the founders, honor Gary, tip a glass for him tonight. He loved to drink, so drink something.